It's I don't know about you, but I like seeing real people. There's real people here, and just something about being. There's something about just experiencing the presence of people, the physical presence of people, that is good. So I'm enjoying this. This morning, I would like to talk about, first of all, why that number's on there, and then I'll get to the main topic. I'd like to get your questions. I probably won't be able to cover. I might be able to cover one or two at the end, but I am really interested when I talk on what was not covered or what you didn't understand well enough, or maybe additional things. So that's my text number. And so you can text me as I'm speaking. You can thumb in your question, but try not to text me until about 20 to 12, because otherwise I'll be distracted by my phone buzzing away in my back pocket throughout while I'm talking. But at 20 to 12, that should give me time, if I'm going to finish just slightly early, to handle one or two questions, and if not, I'll try and get back to you afterwards. So what I'm talking about this morning is why a perfectly just God will appear to be unjust to our culture. Several years ago, some of you may have heard, or just a few years ago actually, that Joshua Harris, author of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, had become a pastor of a large church, but then eventually abandoned his faith. And he describes, and I quote, himself as having fallen away from Christianity. But he's not the only one. You're probably aware of others. Other former pastors, I know of full-time missionaries, worship leaders, youth leaders, and so forth, who were not just hanging on to their faith throughout their Christian experience, but they had actually moved into a position of leadership, and yet reached a point of just abandoning things and falling away. So the big question in my mind was why? Why have they fallen away? How do you explain this? What happened? And so I read a couple of books on the topic. One was by John Marriott, and it's basically addresses how we prepare our young people to lose their faith once they hit their 20s. Interesting. And then another one by Paul Chamberlain, also addressing this question of people falling away from the faith. But I still had questions about why. So I listened to a lot of online testimonials this past year. Online testimonials on YouTube or blogs by these people who had tossed their faith, who had abandoned their faith, and I just took lots of notes. And after I'd listened to them all the ones that I listened to, there's a ton out there, I began to sift through my pages of notes and compile that down into common denominators. And it turned out there were about 6 reasons that they gave, 6 major categories of reasons they gave for abandoning their faith. What was really interesting, though, is after I'd done that, it suddenly struck me that there was certain things that none of them had talked about. And they had not talked about a deeply fulfilling or a personal experiencing the love of God, a personal relationship with God, where they loved God and God loved them, and they worshiped in His presence. That seemed to be missing in their testimonials. That, I think, is the heart and soul of Christianity. It wasn't there. But and I think that would be an excellent topic in and of itself. In fact, it's one of the most important topics. But this morning, I want to talk about another reason why they gave for abandoning their faith, and that is that God appeared to be unjust. In the Bible, the God of the Bible appeared to be unfair and unjust to such a point that He eventually just abandoned the Bible, abandoned the God of the Bible, abandoned their faith, and some of them have become atheists and agnostics now. So I would like to just give you a couple of examples. The destruction of the Canaanites was one they pointed to. Expressions of sexuality, the rules, God's moral laws regarding how we use our sexuality. Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. These are just some of the examples that they gave. So I want to look at 2 ideas this morning. And the first main idea is this: the more imperfect our concept of justice is, the worse a perfect standard of justice will appear to us. And I'll expand on that shortly. The second main idea I want to look at this morning is the greater the difference in knowledge between us and another person, the more unjust that other person will appear to us or seem to be in the kind of decisions they make versus ours, due to the difference in knowledge between the two people. So let's begin with the first major idea, and that is the more imperfect our concept of justice is, the worse a perfect standard of justice will seem to us. A number of years ago, I witnessed an intense discussion. Some incident had arisen, and I can't remember what the exact incident was anymore, but there were two people, and the intense discussion was over what was fair in this particular situation. And it was, I don't know, heated is the word, but it was certainly intense. And the interesting thing about the discussion is that this person over here was sincerely trying to address the reasons why, in their view, this particular action would be the right thing to do, the fair thing to do. But this person over here disagreed, came up with a different decision, and they argued on the basis of a more nuanced and more detailed and complex view of things, a view of justice and fairness. And as a result of their view, they thought that this different decision should be made. And what was clear was each person thought that the other person was dead wrong. And they did so on the basis of their own personal view of what was just and fair. So this person over here thought the other person was just totally off when it come to what's fair in this situation, and they were making that conclusion on the basis of their own view of what's fair and just. But it was also abundantly clear that this person over here thought that person was just dead wrong, and they did so on the basis of their own personal view of what was fair and just. To this day, as I think back on that discussion, I don't know who was right. They both brought good points out, and they were complex, and I honestly don't know what was right. And what that does is it highlights a basic observation of humanity, and the basic observation is this: if there is a difference in opinion on what is right and just between you and someone else, your own standard or your own sense of fairness and justice is the standard by which you will judge the other person's sense of justice and fairness. We just do it all the time. Have you ever met anyone who you thought was unjust and unfair, and based on what? Chances are you base that assessment on your own sense of what's just and fair. And so that highlights a real problem. And I could summarize this problem when it comes to our culture and God and what's just and what's not just in the following 4 statements or premises. Premise number 1 is that our sense of justice is not perfect. It's imperfect. Our sense of justice is simply not perfect. And what I've noticed is that in my discussions with people on whether their own sense of justice and fairness is perfect, pretty much nobody would claim that their own sense of justice is perfect. They would all claim that it's not perfect. They don't know in what areas it's flawed, but they would not be so full of self-pride that they would say that my sense of justice is perfect. So that's the first premise. Our sense of justice is not perfect. Premise number 2. If that's the case, then perfect justice will differ from us on some things, and it'll differ in those areas where our own sense of justice is flawed or imperfect. So and that's the interesting thing. So by our own standards, and this is premise number 3, if someone else's sense of justice differs from ours, then we feel they are unjust. And that's illustrated in that incident that I mentioned, is that we tend to use our own sense of justice as the standard by which we assess the justice of other people's decisions. But if our sense of justice is flawed, that raises a problem. Any perfectly just being, therefore, we're premise number 4 now, will seem unjust to us. In other words, if God is perfectly just and fair, and our sense of justice and fairness is flawed in who knows how many different subtle ways, and since we judge other people's justice by our own sense, then when we look at God's sense of justice and fairness, a perfect sense of justice and fairness will obviously be in conflict with ours, and we tend to think it's the other person's problem. So in the case of our culture today, because our culture is drifting further and further away from flawless fairness and justice, although they might actually believe they're drifting in the right direction, they would at least not have the hubris to claim their sense of justice is fair and perfect, in which case God will look unjust and unfair to our culture today, and even to ourselves many times, because our sense of justice and fairness is a little off. So let me give you an example here that I recently ran into, or a friend of mine ran into. A friend of mine attended a fairly extensive seminar on, let's call it a diversity training seminar put on by his organization. And it lasted several days. And in the course of the seminar, what the various leaders leading various subsections of that seminar, what it emerged is that it appeared that the seminar was focused on primarily creating a picture of there are people in power, with power and privilege in our society, and then there are people with less power and privilege. And the question is, how do we fix that? And the proposal that they put forward in the seminar appeared that, well, basically someone in the seminar said, but is that not doing the very same things to the people in power and privilege that we want to not do to these other people over here? Is that not discrimination? The way we're going to treat these people over here in order to fix this problem over here, the way we treat these problems over here. Now, the leader of the seminar said something very interesting at that point. The response from that person was as follows. It's acknowledging that it looks like we're discriminating and treating a certain group of people in society unfairly, but they said this: it's not discrimination, it's not unfair if the people that we're discriminating against are in a position of power and privilege. Well, I mean, to a certain extent, that seems good. I mean, if the playing field is badly tilted like this, why not tilt it like this to give the people on this end of the lower end of the playing field, a jump start, so to speak? And I think that was what the idea was, to give a jump start here, and then maybe someday, when everything is equal and we can sort of ease off here. Looking at human history, that never works. It never does work to say, well, we'll fix things later on. And so it does appear to be right and good in the short term, but what does God say here? It's interesting. There's a quote here from God. He says, "You shall do no injustice in judgment." So let's just pause there. What he's saying is that I don't want you to corrupt justice itself. He says, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly." In another place, he says, "You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great," and the key word here is alike. A level playing field is what God asks for in our own sense of justice and fairness, a level playing field. So most of us, when we say, "Do you have a good handle on what's right and just?" you might respond by saying, "Well, I think so," because you'd be thinking of murder and robbing banks, and that's obviously wrong. We don't do that. We agree with God there. But then it gets a little more complicated here, because there's a natural tendency to, let's say if I was a judge and there was a person with very low standing in society and they had committed a crime, I would be tempted to cut them a little more slack here, basically not use the same judgment I would against a person in a position of power, wealthy, powerful person. I would be more tempted to, the crime, just let that slide. That's my temptation. Now, it makes it even more complicated because God does actually command us to look out for the orphan and the widow and the oppressed. So we have to do that. But at the same time, without corrupting judgment, and then suddenly things become a little more complex when it comes to what is just and fair. How do you help the oppressed, the poor, the orphans, and the widows? How do you help those people described as being here the small, weak in power in society? How do you help those people while at the same time having a level playing field when it comes to justice and fairness? And I think we could go, it'd be a very interesting discussion, but I think when it comes to fairness and justice, that's one thing when it comes to judging crimes and so forth. But when it comes to being generous and to helping as an act of the will, that's a whole different situation, and you've got to blend those two things together, and that's where people could start getting fairly intense in their discussions. Okay, we won't resolve that here, but it's just to illustrate there's one difference between what God says is right and just and what the people in the seminar were saying is right and just, where it's okay to show partiality. It's okay to discriminate depending on who you're showing discrimination against. But why is this important? Why is it important to go by God's justice rather than our own cultures or our own sense of justiceness? Because in the short term, some things might seem very right, but in the long term, they can lead to devastating consequences. So a key verse here is God says, "There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." So some things can appear to be right in the short term, but in the long term, they will actually be very destructive. And justice is one of those things in this world that we need to guard very carefully. Fairness and justice, so that it is actually a level playing field. Unfortunately, in our society, in a lot of ways, the rich and the powerful get away with a lot of things that I'd actually be in jail for if I did those things. The rich and the powerful. So you got the poor, the rich and the wealthy, whereas in reality, some people would propose doing the teeter-totter. God says no, right there. But where is the right there? God's sense of justice is perfect, ours is not, and that way he will appear to be unjust to our culture. But if the consequences are also to be considered, that brings us to the second point I want to discuss, and that is this. The greater the difference in knowledge between us and another person, the more unjust the other person's decisions will appear to us to be. So when I was a little kid, I was a preschooler. I was probably in my late twos, maybe around 3, but I was probably like 2.5, somewhere in there. I don't have a lot of memories from that time, but if they are really amazingly traumatic, I do remember that, and this was one of those. Mom took me I was at the clinic, and my first scene in this memory is a nurse pulls out a needle, and she's coming for me. I didn't understand anything at that age about vaccinations and diseases, and it was probably either for polio or smallpox. I didn't understand anything about that. All I knew is that she's going to stick this. She looks like she's going to stick this needle in me, and I fought for my life. I was normally a pretty good boy. I respected my elders, but not then. I fought for my life. And they had to bring in an extra person, and they held me down. And my mother was helping them. My mother, the very person that I look to come to my aid when I'm in deep trouble, and this was serious deep trouble, and she was helping them out. And I didn't understand as a little kid, but the idea was this, that she had knowledge that I did not have. And on the basis of that knowledge, and not just her, but the nurses and so forth, They knew that this is for Kirk's best interest, probably for polio, that he doesn't get polio, and therefore he's injected with this. Now, years later, I had a friend who's since passed. He was about my age. He got polio, and he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He got polio as a kid, wheelchair for the rest of his life. And if I had known that piece of information, and faced this wheelchair for the rest of your life or this needle right here, even as a 2.5-year-old or a 3-year-old, I'd probably gone for this over here, because that over there was even worse. And so my point is that if there's a serious difference in knowledge between one person and another, that other person seems to be unjust, and my mom looked like she had betrayed me big time. She helped them out. And I came home, and not only that, I got a spanking afterwards for how I behaved. So he was even worse. Now, okay, so what's the situation here? You could sum it up like this. Premise number 1. The more knowledge that another person has compared to yours, the more likely it is that they will make decisions on the basis of that knowledge that you will disagree with on the basis of your own knowledge. Let me just give you a little bit of a hypothetical illustration. Let's imagine that you and your friend are involved in, you get called in, you're in one room, she's in another room, and each of you are told that there are going to be 10 natural disasters unleashed on this world. They're just unfolding. It's not like somebody's going to make them happen, they're on their way. But each of you has the power to stop them. You can say yes or no. Well, and that's all the information you're given. So, but you can't see what your friend's going to decide until afterwards, and they can't see what you're going to decide. So on the basis of that information, it's a no-brainer. You put a stop to all 10 natural disasters, and your friend who has the same information you do also puts a stop to all 10 natural disasters. Bang. Your friend looks perfectly just and right to you. You find out what she decided afterwards, and they look real just. But now let's imagine this. You're in the room again with the 10 natural disasters. You're given no information other than what the disasters will be. But your friend is given information as to what the consequences will be for the next 100 years after each natural disaster. Your friend now has a fair amount more knowledge than you. And your friend, on the basis of that extra information that you do not have, decides to let one of those natural disasters proceed. Well, you're over here and you find out the results. You put a stop to all 10, but your friend let one of them proceed. You have questions about your friend's sense of justice and what was fair because she let one of those natural disasters proceed. But remember, your friend knew 100 years worth of additional information that you do not have. Now, final scenario. Still the same 2 rooms. You're over here. All you know is the 10 natural disasters are going to happen. You can stop them, yes or no. You say, stop all of them. But your friend here is given information about what all the consequences will be of each natural disaster for the next 2,000 years. An enormous amount of information on all the consequences and all this. On the basis of that information, she lets 4 out of the 10 natural disasters unfold. You're over here and you find out, and now you have serious, you're actually quite angry. She flipping a coin, it's almost like 50-50. Don't tell me she is just anymore, but you are judging her on the basis of the information you had, which was pretty much nothing. She made her decision on the basis of 2,000 years worth of information on consequences unfolding as a result of each of the 10. Well, that illustrates the problem here, that the more knowledge that another person has compared to yours, the more likely it is that they'll make decisions on the basis of their information that you would disagree with. Now, think about this next premise, number 2. The difference between your own knowledge and the knowledge of an omniscient, all-knowing God is enormous. There's an enormous disparity in information here between yours and God's. So let's take all your knowledge that you've accumulated over your lifetime, and let's put it in a pile here on the stage. Let's just say the pile is this big. All the knowledge you've accumulated. Actually, if you put it on a thumb drive on your phone, it might even be quite a bit smaller than that. But then let's imagine God's pile over here. How big would that pile be? Omniscience is defined as the knowledge of everything that's logically possible to know. Well, it certainly would fill the sanctuary here. It'd probably just bury the nation of Canada. It might fill the solar system. It might not be enough room in the entire universe to fit that pile of knowledge. And yet we are making decisions on the basis of this little wee pile over here about God's decisions, which are made on the basis of a massive set of information that includes everything that's logically possible to know. So, premise number 3, therefore, it is highly likely that God will allow or even bring about an enormous number of incidents in this world that you will strongly disagree with based on your own little pile of information that you have here. Same goes for our culture today. How much foresight does our culture have in relation to its hindsight? And if our culture today is not that interested in history, even the hindsight is pretty small when it comes to civilizations. Well, no doubt there's going to be an enormous discrepancy between what our culture thinks God should permit and what actually gets allowed. Let me give you an example here where that might fit actually both of my 2 major points, and it has to do with how we use our sexuality. So that God has given us a number of commands that we might call moral commands to do with how we exercise the sexuality that we have, moral commands. To our society today, that does not seem right at all, because our society sees us as merely a body. Secular society does not recognize the existence of an eternal human soul. All its psychology and all its sociology and all its decisions in Parliament and so forth are based on this idea that basically we are a body and that's it. So it makes no sense to tell your body, to deprive your body of things that your body wants, since that's essentially you speaking to your body there. But there's a Rosetta Stone verse in the Bible, and I call it a Rosetta Stone verse because the real Rosetta Stone revealed to archaeologists how to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics. It opened up a window of knowledge and understanding. And I have this term that I use for verses in the Bible that I also call Rosetta Stone verses. And this Rosetta Stone verse says this: flee fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. That last phrase opens up a whole field of understanding into God's moral law, and specifically God's laws regarding sexual immorality. It says, which wage war against the soul. The implication is there that we're not just a body. We are eternal human souls with a vastly greater destiny than being just a body has. And we're eternal human souls that dwell within a physical body. And that physical body God describes often as a jar of clay, as a house, as a tent, as a garment. The picture there that God uses in the scriptures that our body is what clothes our eternal souls. It's a very important part of you. It's a holy part of you, actually. If you're a believer, it's a dwelling place of God himself through the person of the Holy Spirit. But when he says, flee fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul, the implication there is that God wants you to flourish as a being created in the image and likeness of God, a being with an eternal soul, and that soul must not be subjugated by your body, by the flesh, specifically the strong physical instincts your body may have. It must not be in subjugation to that, because what defines you is your eternal soul. The seat of your mind, your sense of justice, your ability to worship God, ability to perceive beauty, that all is part of your eternal soul. And so number one is, if a society or a culture does not recognize that God's laws of sexual morality are actually to prevent pain and suffering and put a person in a position to flourish as a being created in the image of God, if it's not recognized that, then the laws will make no sense. God's moral laws will make no sense. In fact, they will appear unjust. So our society's sense of justice will say that's wrong. Secondly, if society doesn't see that the consequences of violating those laws, of subjugating the eternal human soul to be dominated by just the physical instincts of our body, then there will be enormous consequences. And J.D. Unwin, sociologist at Oxford, published a book called Sex and Culture. It looked at 83 civilizations and cultures, and every one of them, when they turned the corner on sexual freedom, was collapsed within 100 years. No exception, irreversible. And when you read the book and see the symptoms of that beginning of the collapse, it's all here right now in our civilization. We are well on our way to a total collapse. So there are enormous consequences. So it's an example of that. Here's something else to think about. Another example. Most atheist philosophers who, although they don't believe in God, do concede that if God did exist, then he would not permit pointless evils. And a pointless evil or a gratuitous evil is an evil or an instance where it did not bring about a greater good and it did not prevent a greater evil. It was pointless. There was no point in allowing it to happen. And so they pretty much unanimously grant this, and on the basis of that premise, they actually argue that God does not exist, because it appears to us to be a lot of evils in this world that so far as we can see are pointless. Therefore, God does not exist. That's their argument. So if we grant their initial premise, which I do, and that is that a perfectly just, right, all-powerful God would not allow pointless evil, there's a massive implication here. And the massive implication is that basically what happens when an entire civilization or culture becomes a pointless evil. By the atheist's own premise, God must terminate it. So in the case of Canaan, which is often one of the examples raised, we see all the classic earmarks of just exactly such a situation. 400 years, during the time of Abraham, 400 years before Israel entered the land of Canaan and destroyed the Amorites, God says, you can't have this land yet because the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. In other words, put it differently, the Amorite culture right now, the consequences of allowing that and protecting that culture to the end of human history is positive. It's a net positive contribution to civilization at that point. So you can't have it now. But there will reach a point 400 years from now where the Amorites' culture must be destroyed because it crosses the threshold in becoming a pointless evil. And we're given a number of examples of things they practiced, and the word practiced is used here. Incest, sex with animals, human sacrifices. Now these things go on in all different cultures, but they don't reach the level of becoming the cultural norm or being the practice of these cultures, like God said the Amorite culture did eventually become. But there's another question, well, what about, is everybody evil in that culture? And why shouldn't God just save the good people and punish the bad? And that appears to be what happened, because God said to Israel, as they were approaching the land of Canaan, 40 years earlier, 40 years before the invasion, God says, I am sending the hornet before you, I guess a plague of hornets, and it'll slowly drive the people out of the land, but not too fast, lest it become desolate and the weeds and the wild animals take over, which implies that probably the majority of people would be driven out before the Israelites arrived at Canaan. The majority of people will be. And so it's kind of like the ones that remain are the evil ones that will have to be destroyed. The ones that shouldn't be destroyed are actually being driven out of the land. And the interesting thing is, God says the exact same thing will happen to Israel as well. And we know that happened several centuries later, where the Babylonians came and just annihilated the Israelites, except for some that they moved to Babylon. He says those are like the good figs. The ones left behind are the rotten figs. They'll have to be destroyed. So you see, God's sense of justice here isn't just against the Amorites, it was also against the Israelites as well. And there are huge implications for our civilization today. The big question is not so much whether God was justified or not in allowing the Amorite civilization to be terminated, but what our own civilization, where it's going. And that's a sobering thought. Now, if you're interested in a more academic approach to this, that website has a paper that I published in a philosophy journal. It was a secular peer-reviewed paper. And if nothing else, it'll put you to sleep in 5 minutes, so you can, if you're having problems getting to bed at night, that'll help. So here's my point. If we believe, and there seems to be pretty much unanimous acceptance of this premise, that God should prevent evils that are pointless, then what happens when an entire culture or civilization reaches a stage where it will produce a greater evil than if it was terminated? A lot of implications. So in conclusion, if my own sense of justice is not perfect, number one, God will seem unjust. Number two, if my own knowledge is less than an all-knowing being, then God will seem unjust. Those are the two things we've looked at this morning. So I want to end with a just brief quote from Job, and I see I got some text messages here. I can't handle all those questions, but I'll at least look at one. Job suffered massively, lost all his children in one day, lost all his wealth in one day. And then when it looks like it's finally over, then he's hit with enormous physical suffering through boils from head to foot. And he thought this is a bad deal, and he had lots of complaints. But in the end, God showed up. He appeared, or he spoke to Job, and he started asking Job questions that he could not answer. Difficult questions that highlighted how small Job's knowledge was in comparison to God. And when God was finished, Job realized, he said this, "Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth." For a few minutes or a few hours or days, wherever it was, he began to see just how huge the disparity was between the knowledge of God and the knowledge of a finite human being. And that is why God appears so unjust to our culture today, and it's why he will often appear, even in our own terms, sometimes unjust to us. Now, I just want to take one question, and for the remainder of them, I think, here's beautiful question. They're all excellent questions, but here's one. Since our knowledge is so limited, how are we ever supposed to take a stance on anything? Because you might be walking home tomorrow night and you're passing by a back alley and you see some poor homeless person being beat up by some young thugs. And your first instance is to go and help the homeless person, but then you remember, oh, wait a sec, maybe I'll unleash a series of consequences that will destroy the world if I help the poor person out. So it's an excellent question. In fact, that question was raised in response to one of my other papers, and there's another paper where I addressed that question. So here it is. There's another moral principle God seems to have given us, and that is this. We are morally obligated to act on the basis of what we could reasonably be expected to know. That's our job. So if that person looks like they need help, we are morally obligated to help them. God acts on the basis of what he could reasonably be expected to know. And how much could an omniscient being be reasonably expected to know? An awful lot of stuff. Fill the universe. So that's God's problem, what he allows, what he does not allow. My response to what should we take a stance on is what we could reasonably be expected to know is what God expects us to take responsibility for and to act on. I hope that kind of answers the question there. That we, just to give you an illustration, and this is the way it works in court. Let's say you're taking a chimney off, like my son-in-law was doing, busted an old chimney, and you have to get the bricks down from the roof to the ground, to the floor, to the yard. Well, let's say you were tossing the bricks off the roof, and somebody was walking by the sidewalk, and you nailed somebody in the head with a brick from 2 stories up, and they got seriously injured, and you got charged, and you went to court, and you were charged with whatever, and you said to the judge, yes, but, and it would be the honest truth, I didn't know the person was down there when I chucked the brick off the roof. What would the judge say? Probably something like, it was within reasonable expectation that you could have checked first before you toss the brick. So in today, even in our own system of justice, you are expected to act on the basis of what you could reasonably be expected to know. And so that's why we just don't sit there in moral indecision all the time. We do need to act on what appears right and good to us, all the time asking God for direction. And if we're doing something that is going to destroy the world, well, that's God's responsibility. He will step in and orchestrate history in the way that he does. Well, I have to stop now, and so I'll turn it back to the music. We're going to have a couple of songs, but I just want to close in a short prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you that we can truly rest in you, that you are the kind of God that is perfectly good. You are the origin of every good thing given and every perfect gift. You are the origin of justice and love and beauty and music and every good thing, and you invite us to put our faith in you. Please help us do that. Please help us put our faith in you. And also, God, I ask you to help us to have a more objective view on just how tiny our knowledge is in comparison to yours, and consequently put our faith in you for your direction and guidance in our daily decisions. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.